Imagine a scenario that seems absolutely impossible and completely contradicts common sense. You walk into the office of Marshal Georgy Zhukov in 1945, and on the wall, you see a ceremonial portrait of the leader of the Third Reich. It sounds like madness, like a script for a cheap alternative history movie, because we know exactly who fought whom and who the enemy was. However, when we begin to carefully study the events of 1812, casting aside school textbooks, we encounter inconsistencies of exactly this magnitude. Official history offers us a neat picture of patriotic resistance, but documents from that era and strange artifacts paint a completely different reality. It is generally accepted that Napoleon invaded Russia to crush Alexander I. But if you look at the French emperor's personal correspondence and staff documents, a strange vacuum appears. There is almost no mention of Russia as the main political enemy in the form we are used to perceiving it. Instead, European sources of that time and maps constantly feature names like Muscovy, Great Tartary, and references to a confrontation with certain Asian hordes. One gets the impression that the Grand Army was marching to fight not against St. Petersburg, but against a completely different force, which was subsequently carefully erased from the pages of history books. The geography of this war raises even more questions for anyone familiar with strategy. The capital of the Russian Empire, the center of administrative power, and the home of the emperor was St. Petersburg. This city was much closer to the borders from which the French were advancing and was strategically more vulnerable. Any logical military commander wanting to decapitate an enemy state would have directed his strike there. But Napoleon, a recognized military genius, makes an inexplicable maneuver. He ignores the capital and leads a huge army deep into the continent, towards Moscow. Why did he need an old merchant city if the political heart of the empire was beating on the banks of the Neva? This only makes sense in one case. If the real capital of the power he was fighting was actually in Moscow, not St. Petersburg. The oddities continue in details that are presented to us as historical anecdotes. We are told how Napoleon waited on Poklonnya Hill for boyars with the keys to the city. But wait a minute. The boyar class was officially abolished by Peter the Great back in the early 18th century, more than 100 years before these events. Expecting a delegation of boyars in 1812 is like expecting knights in shining armor at UN negotiations today. Either French intelligence committed a catastrophic failure by not knowing who lived in the enemy country, or those called boyars actually existed but belonged to that same vanished Muscovite Tartary that official historians prefer to remain silent about. We are told that Moscow burned down because it was wooden. This is a convenient explanation for schoolchildren, but it ignores the facts. The construction of wooden houses in the city center had been banned by special decrees since the time of Peter the Great to avoid large-scale fires. By 1812, the center of Moscow was built of stone and brick. Stone cities do not flare up like matchsticks from a stray spark. Nevertheless, the events that unfolded that summer are described as a global catastrophe that destroyed the city to the ground. And here we approach a line where political intrigues end and a real nightmare begins. Paper can be rewritten, maps can be redrawn, but it is impossible to hide the traces of the physical destruction of a city. What happened in Moscow does not fit the description of an ordinary fire, and eyewitness accounts make one's blood run cold, hinting at the use of technologies that, according to the official version, simply could not have existed then. Brigadier General of the French Army, Count Philippe de Ségur, stood at the window, watching with horror as flames devoured not just wooden structures, but the solid stone walls of Kitaygorod. In his memoirs, he would later describe this spectacle as something beyond human understanding. The army, which only yesterday considered itself a glorious victor, suddenly turned into a band of criminals whom the heavens themselves seemed to be judging. And this is not just a figure of speech. Descriptions of what was happening in Moscow make one doubt the official version of a simple arson committed by retreating residents or saboteurs of Governor Rostopchin. Eyewitness testimonies from both sides of the front paint a picture of a technological catastrophe, not an ordinary fire. Officers located in different parts of the city independently reported strange celestial phenomena. Above the city, they observed not just flying sparks, but actual fireballs descending from the sky. One such ball, according to Segura's records, descended directly onto the palace of Prince Trubetskoy, instantly igniting it. This description resembles a targeted bombardment or the use of an unknown weapon rather than the chaotic spread of fire from a torch. Even more inexplicable is the nature of the destruction. Stone, as we know, does not burn. It can get sooty, crack from heat, but not disappear. However, in Moscow in 1812, stone buildings literally exploded from within. Eyewitnesses described a terrifying sequence: a light crackle, a bright flash, a stream of smoke, and only ruins remained where a monumental structure stood. Brick and stone crumbled into dust, as if under the influence of a colossal shockwave or vibration. Such material behavior cannot be explained by burning wooden furniture inside the rooms. Casualty statistics finally destroy the myth of an ordinary fire. For comparison, we can take the documented fire of 1737. Back then, Moscow was indeed predominantly wooden. The fire raged terribly, destroying thousands of houses. But how many people died? Only 94. People managed to run away, to save themselves from the slowly advancing fire. In 1812, in a city built of stone, by the admission of the French themselves, about 30,000 soldiers of Napoleon's army perished. This is a huge figure, comparable to losses in a major battle such as Borodino. How could 30,000 healthy, mobile men burn alive in a city they could have walked out of? This indicates that the damaging factor was instantaneous and inescapable, giving no chance for salvation. The strangeness continued even after the fire died down. Continuous heavy rains began to fall over the ruins of the city, as if nature was trying to wash away traces of something poisonous. Survivors, both Russians and French, described their condition as deep shock. They wandered through the ashes like sleepwalkers who had lost their will and reason. Many suffered from unexplained weakness and illnesses, the symptoms of which would today cause doctors to suspect radiation sickness or severe chemical poisoning. Neither Russia nor France benefited from such destruction of resources and people. This catastrophe equalized everyone. Yesterday's enemies, shaken by what they saw, warmed themselves by the same fires, forgetting about the war. It seemed that, in that moment, they ceased to be opponents and became witnesses to the destruction of something third, something much more ancient and important. And if you look closely at the behavior of these two armies, you can notice a frightening detail. They were suspiciously similar. Like two hands of the same body, performing, perhaps, the same task of clearing the territory. It was practically impossible to distinguish them in the smoke of the fires. And this similarity hides the next, no less shocking riddle. If you look closely at the opposing sides of the conflict of 1812, it starts to feel like we are looking into a mirror that only slightly distorts the reflection. Official history insists on irreconcilable enmity between the Russian Empire and France. But the daily reality of that war throws up facts that completely destroy this picture. One of the most discouraging aspects is the soldiers' uniforms. It would seem vital on the battlefield to instantly distinguish friend from foe. However, the famous hussar and partisan Denis Davidov described very telling curiosities in his memoirs. During raids, his detachments often came under attack from Russian peasants. Ordinary people, seeing the uniforms, the cut, the epaulets, and the shakos, could not find differences between the Russian liberators and the French invaders. Davidov and his men had to change into simple peasant kaftans and grow beards so that their own people would stop seeing them as enemies. There are claims that such confusion was not accidental. Evil tongues and archive researchers mention correspondence between Alexander I and Napoleon, where the monarchs allegedly discussed the unification of the color and style of military uniforms. If this is true, then we are facing a unique case in world history. The commanders-in-chief of mortally warring armies agreeing that their soldiers should look practically identical. This looks more like preparation for a joint parade or police operation than a total war of annihilation. The language issue causes even deeper cognitive dissonance. We are used to hearing about the Patriotic War of 1812, about the rise of the Russian national spirit. But why then was all the documentation of this war conducted in the language of the aggressor? This concerns not only the salon conversations of the aristocracy, for whom French was a second native language. We are talking about state documents of the highest importance. Alexander I's manifesto on the results of the war was written in French. The Tsar's decrees of 1813 were issued in French. An album with portraits of war heroes, released in St. Petersburg immediately after the expulsion of Napoleon, was printed entirely in the language of the defeated enemy. Imagine a situation where Stalin issues an order about the victory over Germany exclusively in German. It looks absurd, but for the era of 1812, this is somehow considered the norm. Relations between the emperors also raise a lot of questions. On a commemorative sign installed at the crossing of the Berezina River near Studenka, the site of the tragic death of thousands of French soldiers, the profiles of two emperors are depicted at once: Alexander and Napoleon. What did descendants or contemporaries want to say by this? That both won? Or that they acted in concert? Even more strange was the celebration of the centennial of the war in 1912. At the Jubilee exhibition in St. Petersburg, portraits of Napoleon were lovingly laid out with fresh flowers. Commemorative cups, perfumes, and souvenirs glorifying the French army were released. One of the paintings of that time depicts a scene where Alexander I supposedly presents Cossacks, Bashkirs, and Kalmyks to Napoleon. The Russian troops are depicted not as opponents, but as a kind of resource being transferred to a partner. At the same time, Russian military commanders in portraits often wear the orders of Prussia and Austria, countries that were officially allies of Napoleon. All this suggests that the War of 1812 might not have been a clash between two powers at all, but a joint punitive operation of a united Europe and the House of Romanov against someone third. One could try to write all this off as the strange fashion of a gallant age, respect for a worthy opponent, or the whims of the aristocracy. Paper documents and paintings can be interpreted in two ways. However, there is something that is much harder to fake or misinterpret. This is granite and bronze. Monuments erected in honor of those events have stood before our eyes for 200 years, and if you look closely at their details, they tell a story that makes one feel truly uneasy. Paper archives can burn, and ink can fade or be rewritten to please the ruling dynasty. However, there are witnesses who cannot be silenced, and are extremely difficult to fake retroactively. These are granite, marble, and bronze. Monuments erected immediately after the events of 1812, or for their centennial jubilee, contain symbolism that, upon careful examination, completely destroys the familiar picture of the world. These monuments stand in plain sight, but their true meaning often eludes the gaze clouded by school dogmas. The most glaring inconsistency concerns the main state symbols. The coat of arms of the Russian Empire, as is well known, was a double-headed eagle looking west and east. The coat of arms of Napoleonic France was a single-headed eagle, looking in one direction, a legacy of the Roman legions. Logic suggests that French eagles should be on the graves of French soldiers, and Russian ones on monuments to Russian heroes. At the site of the Shevardino Redoubt, at the request of France, a monument was erected to the fallen soldiers of the Grand Army, topped with a single-headed eagle. This looks fair and logical. But when we approach the monument dedicated to the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, Mikhail Kutuzov, a shock awaits us. The top of the obelisk is adorned, not by the sovereign double-headed symbol of Russia, but by exactly the same French single-headed eagle. This cannot be written off as a sculptor's mistake. Monuments of this level were approved personally by the emperor. Imagining a monument to Marshal Zhukov or Rokossovsky, topped with the heraldry of the Third Reich, is unthinkable. However, in the case of Kutuzov and other monuments to liberators, for example in Smolensk, we see exactly this. Single-headed eagles are everywhere. This forces us to assume that in 1812, this symbol was not exclusively the mark of the enemy. Perhaps it designated a united army, or an alliance in which Russia and France acted together. The oddities continue in numismatics. The French National Library holds medals minted in honor of the capture of Moscow. The church domes depicted on them are topped not with Orthodox crosses, but with symbols resembling pagan signs or solar symbols. And on the medal dedicated to the Battle of Borodino, the warriors are dressed not in 19th century uniforms, but in classic Roman armor. Moreover, battle scenes often feature three warriors, which transparently hints at the presence of a third side to the conflict. If Alexander I and Napoleon were just two duelists, who is this third one? The final verdict on official geography is delivered by a map carved on one of the memorial stones of that era. It is supposed to depict the Russian Empire that defended its borders. But the borders of the state on this map strangely end at the Ural Mountains. The vast expanses of Siberia and the Far East, which today are an integral part of the country, are simply absent from the monument, or not included in the possessions of St. Petersburg. The authorities either did not know the real size of their territories, which is unlikely for an empire, or the borders of the Romanov state in the early 19th century really ended at the Urals. This stone evidence places a frightening but inevitable question before us. If the Russian Empire ended at the Urals, what was further out there in the east? A huge void? Ownerless lands? History does not tolerate a vacuum. There must have been a state possessing huge territory and resources. It was likely against this colossal neighbor that the monarchs of Europe and the St. Petersburg House of Romanov united. Here, a civilization enters the stage that was not just conquered, but erased from the memory of mankind. The answer to the riddle of where the borders of the Romanov Empire ended and what lay beyond the Ural Mountains can be found in geographical atlases and encyclopedias published before the 19th century. There, across the vast expanses of Eurasia, from the Urals to the Pacific Ocean, and from the Arctic Ocean to India, stretched a state designated by large letters, Grand Tartary, or Great Tartary. Its composition included Muscovite Tartary with its capital in Moscow. This explains the fact why Napoleon in his letters and orders mentioned not Russia, but specifically Tartary and Asian hordes. If we accept the hypothesis of the existence of this state, then the whole picture of the War of 1812 changes radically, turning from a patriotic defense into a large-scale joint operation of the West against the East. In this new coordinate system, Alexander I and Napoleon cease to be sworn enemies. On the contrary, they appear as allies, representatives of a single European civilization, the New World Order of that time. The Romanov dynasty, oriented towards the West, speaking French, and alien to native traditions, was based in St. Petersburg. Napoleon, meanwhile, united continental Europe under his banners. Their common goal could have been the ancient, independent Muscovite Tartary, a shard of the old empire that stood in the way of the geopolitical redistribution of the world. That is why the strike was delivered against Moscow, the heart of this ancient power, and not against the loyal to the West, St. Petersburg. This theory brilliantly explains the oddities in the iconography of that war. It becomes clear why, on medals and bas-reliefs, the warriors of the United Army are depicted in antique Roman armor. This is not just an artistic convention of classicism. It is a symbol of the Holy Roman Empire, heirs to which both the French Emperor and the Russian Tsars considered themselves, striving to Europeanize their domains. They are opposed by completely different characters. On old engravings and paintings, we see bearded warriors with bows, arrows, and spears. Official history calls them Bashkirs or Cossacks in the service of the Tsar, but the scenes captured by artists say otherwise. In one famous painting, Alexander I demonstrates these people to Napoleon. It looks not like a presentation of elite units to an ally, but like a display of exotic trophies or captured leaders of conquered tribes. These people are dressed differently. They are armed with obsolete weapons, and, notably, they do not remove their headdresses before the emperors, which, according to the etiquette of that time, was unthinkable insolence for subjects. Most likely, these were representatives of the defeated army of Tartary, rulers of captured territories who were being forced to accept the new power. The internal situation in the country in 1812 also confirms the version of a civil war or a war of conquest. Historical chronicles sparingly mention 67 major peasant uprisings that flared up that year. Surprisingly, these rebellions were suppressed not by the French, but by regular troops under the command of Tsar Alexander's officers. The peasants, maintaining loyalty to old traditions and perhaps the old dynasty, saw the armies coming from the west, both French and St. Petersburgian, as occupiers. They resisted the forced westernization and enslavement brought by the Romanov power. Thus, 1812 became the final point in the existence of Great Tartary. Its capital was burned using total destruction methods, its elite destroyed or assimilated, and the very name of the state was forever erased from geographical maps. History was rewritten by the victors. The Romanovs appropriated the victory over the usurper Napoleon, hiding the fact of the alliance, and the death of a huge civilization was masked as the invasion of 12 languages. However, as often happens in major crimes, after the murder of the victim, the question of dividing the inheritance inevitably arises. War is a colossal expense, and someone had to pay for this banquet. The financial trail left after the devastation of Moscow leads us to the final proof, which cannot be refuted by ideology. Any crime, whether it is a household robbery or the destruction of an entire civilization, always leaves a financial trail. Money is the blood of war, and its movement often says much more about real motives than the pompous speeches of generals. When the smoke over the ashes of Moscow cleared, a logical question arose. Where did the untold riches of the ancient capital disappear to? It is known that wagons loaded with gold, silver, and jewelry were taken out of the Kremlin and rich Moscow mansions. Legends about Napoleon's treasure, allegedly drowned in one of the lakes during the retreat, have stirred the minds of treasure hunters for 2 centuries. But not a single serious hoard has ever been found. These treasures did not surface in Paris, nor in St. Petersburg. They seemed to dissolve into thin air. However, if we look at the financial results of the war, a picture opens up that completely overturns the notions of winner and loser. By the laws of war, the losing side pays reparations. The winner loots, takes trophies, and issues bills. But the behavior of the Russian army in Paris in 1814 was unprecedentedly mild. Cossacks did not loot the Louvre. Officers paid for lunches in bistros with gold. Moreover, there was a documented fact that historians try not to advertise. The commander of the Russian occupation corps, Count Mikhail Vorontsov, before leaving France, personally paid off all the debts of his officers and soldiers to French creditors. We are talking about a colossal sum, equivalent to approximately 30 tons of silver. Think about the absurdity of the situation. Russia, the victorious country, whose ancient capital lies in ruins, whose lands are ravaged, instead of demanding compensation, pays the defeated France huge amounts of money. This cannot be explained by nobility or chivalry. In big politics, such concepts do not exist. But in business, this is called final settlement of the contract. If we assume that Napoleon performed the function of a hired cleaner, hired to destroy Muscovite Tartary, then the vanished Moscow gold became the first part of his fee, and the payments of Vorontsov and other officials are the closing of the remaining debt to partners. In this context, the huge subsidies that Alexander I received from Great Britain also become understandable. It was a global redistribution of the world, where France and Russia acted as a single fist of the West, crushing the last stronghold of independent Asia. Tartary fell, its riches were divided, history was rewritten, and the peoples received a beautiful fairy tale about the Great Patriotic War to hide the fact of the greatest betrayal and genocide. We live in a world drawn by the winners. History textbooks are merely an agreed-upon version of events, convenient for the ruling elites. But the truth, like a sprout through asphalt, always breaks through to the outside. The facts we have analyzed, from strange fires to French eagles on monuments to Russian heroes, are just the tip of the iceberg. The depth of the rabbit hole is much greater than you can imagine. Many documents and testimonies are still classified or lie in the public domain but are ignored by academic science.